Long before Pontefract became the quiet town that people know today, it was something else entirely different. Its history stretches back beyond the Romans, and to an age where law was fragile, punishment was brutal, and fear shaped the land. By the 12th century, those accused of crimes were taken to a lonely hill on the outskirts of town, a place locals would later call Gallows Hill. But the gallows were not placed there by chance. They stood at a crossroads, and in medieval England, crossroads were believed to disorient the dead. Combined with the height of the hill, the location was chosen for a reason. Not just to execute the condemned, but to ensure their spirits would never find a way back to the location of the crime they had committed, so they could never haunt it. The executions would continue. It was a dark time, where superstition and justice blurred into one. And centuries later, on that very hill, on that very spot, the house of 30 East Drive was built. On a hot summer's day in August 1966, the Pritchard family were spending the afternoon quietly in their back garden in Pontefract. Joe Pritchard lay in the sun alongside his wife, Jean. Nearby were their children, Philip, aged 15, and Diane, who was either 12 or 13 at the time, depending on the account. It was an ordinary day, warm and still, the kind of afternoon where time passed slowly. Inside the house was Sarah Scholes. She was described in some reports as the children's grandmother and in others as a close family friend. She had gone indoors to escape the heat, and she sat down in the front porch, knitting a cardigan, and her attention fixed entirely on the pattern in front of her. At first, the noises were easy to dismiss. Tapping, banging, the sort of sounds old houses sometimes make, but they didn't stop. After a while, Joe asked Philip to go inside and see what was causing them. Philip got up from the garden and walked toward the back door. As he stepped inside, the sounds from the outside faded, replaced by the dull and closed quiet of the home. He paused briefly, listening, before following the tapping through the hallway. When he reached the porch, he saw Sarah sitting exactly where she had been, knitting calmly and unaware that anything unusual was happening. And as Philip approached the porch, he noticed something immediately. Above Sarah's head, suspended in the middle of the room, was a fine white powder drifting down through the air. It wasn't falling from the ceiling. There was no cracks, no loose plaster, nothing above it at all. According to multiple accounts, the powder appeared to begin several feet above the floor, at around head height, as though it were forming in the air itself before slowly settling. Sarah hadn't noticed it. Her needles continued to move steadily. Philip hesitated and then drew her attention to it. Sarah reacted instinctively, accusing Philip of causing the mess. But even as she spoke, she realised something wasn't right. The ceiling above them was completely clear. The dust had not come from above. Sarah fetched a dustpan and brush when she noticed pools of water forming across the kitchen floor. At that moment, she called Jean inside to help clean it up. They worked methodically, wiping the floor dry, only to watch the water return just moments later. Joe and Philip came inside and lifted the floorboards, convinced the pipe must have burst, but they found that the concrete beneath the floor was completely bone dry. There was no leak, and there was no explanation. Believing the problem might still be connected to the water supply, Joe stepped back outside and turned off the water at the mains. It was then he noticed something else that unsettled him far more than the flooding itself. Diane was sitting quietly in the garden, seemingly unaware of the disturbances inside the home. She hadn't reacted to the noises, the water, or the tension around her. Joe later described it as though she were detached from everything happening, calm, distant, and almost trance-like. It was only later that evening, after night had fallen, that the tapping noises returned with renewed force. Joe and Philip moved through the house, room by room, trying to trace the sound. Each time they thought they were close, it seemed to shift away from them, reappearing elsewhere, just out of reach. The following morning, Jean contacted the water authority. An inspector arrived to check the drains and the pipes and found nothing was wrong. His explanation was brief. It was condensation, and he left without offering a solution. Over the next week, the atmosphere inside the house changed dramatically. The noises became more frequent, particularly at night. Doors were heard slamming shut when no one was near them. Objects began moving on their own. Flower pots, ornaments, and full cups of tea were found in different rooms only moments after being left elsewhere. Photographs were found knocked from walls, some later discovered torn or slashed, the damage unexplained. Stones and pebbles were reported striking the roof, often late in the evening. And one afternoon, while cleaning the fireplace, Jean was struck in the head when a collection of old keys fell down the chimney. Some belonged to the family. Others were unfamiliar. Old keys she had never seen before. Soon, objects were being thrown from walls. The tapping became violent enough to cause cracks in the ceiling of one of the bedrooms, and the light switches flicked on and off by themselves. During a visit from a vicar, the main electrical switchboard shut down, despite being locked inside a cabinet. Not long after, the family's grandfather clock fell from the landing and smashed near the front door. The vicar promised to return, but he never did. These disturbances were not witnessed by the family alone. According to multiple reports, police officers, journalists, clergy, and at least one member of parliament observed unusual activity inside the home, and they all advised the Pritchards to leave. The Pritchards refused, claiming, quote, "We need to stay and beat this thing." Local newspapers began referring to the unseen force as Mr. Nobody. The family themselves gave it another name, Fred. This was an attempt to reduce the fear and make the situation feel more manageable. Gradually, it became clear that it was centering on one person, Diane. By this point, it was becoming clear that the disturbances inside the home were no longer random. They were beginning to focus on Diane. According to her family, the change was gradual at first. Diane began complaining of strange experiences at night, often while she was asleep. On more than one occasion, she woke up suddenly, screaming, and told her parents that she had been struck across the face by something that she could not see. When Joe and Jean rushed to her room, there was no one else present, and nothing appeared disturbed. At the time, the family struggled to understand what was happening. There were no explanations for the marks that sometimes appeared on their daughter's skin, and no signs of anyone entering her room. What made it more unsettling was these incidents were not accompanied by noise or warning. Diane would simply wake in distress, insisting something had touched her or hit her. As the days passed, the activity around her intensified. On some nights, Diane claimed she was pulled sharply while in bed, as though something had grabbed her without warning, and her body being yanked suddenly, enough to leave her shaken and frightened. Bruises and scratches appeared on her arms and neck following these incidents, though no clear cause could ever be found. These moments marked a clear shift in the nature of the haunting. What had once consisted of unexplained sounds and moving objects was now causing direct physical harm to a child. Around the same period, other disturbing incidents were reported within the home. Some accounts describe green foam emerging from the taps, others mention water seeping from the walls during religious prayers, or crosses being found turned upside down. While not all of these details are consistently documented, they appear repeatedly in later testimonies and reflect a growing sense that the house itself had become hostile. By this stage, the family no longer believed they were dealing with an isolated disturbance or harmless activity. Whatever was inside that house appeared to be aware of Diane. The sense that something was building toward a more serious confrontation was unmistakable. Up until this point, whatever was happening inside the house had made itself known through sound, movement, and violence. Objects were thrown, rooms were disturbed. Diane had begun suffering physical attacks, but whatever was responsible had remained unseen. That changed with Jean. One evening, while standing alone in the kitchen peeling potatoes, Jean was suddenly struck by the unmistakable feeling that she was no longer alone. It wasn't panic that stopped her. It was certainty. The clear awareness that someone or something was standing directly behind her. She turned around, and sure enough, standing only a few feet away, was a tall, dark figure dressed in what appeared to be a monk's habit. The robe was long and heavy looking, and a cowl obscured the figure's face completely. Jean later said the figure did not appear transparent or shadow-like. It looked solid, physical, as though a real person had entered the room without making a sound. The figure did not speak. It did not move toward her. It did not touch her. And after several moments, Jean watched as it began to sink downward, slowly disappearing onto the floor beneath it, until it was gone entirely. On a separate occasion, Jean later claimed that as she woke in the early hours of the morning, that same figure was hovering above her bed. It appeared to be floating, suspended in the air, silent and motionless, just watching her. And once again it did not touch her nor speak, and moments later it vanished. Following these encounters, the figure was reported on more than one occasion, always briefly and always silently, and always gone within moments. Its appearance marked a clear shift in the nature of the haunting. What had once felt chaotic now seemed controlled. As attention turned to the history of the area, journalists and later writers began to examine Pontefract's past. For centuries, the town had been closely tied to religious institutions. Monks and clerics were active in the region, and monastic orders once held significant influence there, until their sudden and violent removal during the reign of Henry VIII. During that period, monasteries and priories across England were dissolved, and members of religious orders were expelled, imprisoned, or executed. And against this historical backdrop, a darker story began to circulate. According to later accounts, a monk was once accused of the sexual assault and murder of a young girl, and was executed at the gallows, at the very site where 30 East Drive now stands. Some versions of that story claim that he was hanged for his crimes. Over time, this alleged execution became linked to the site where the house was later built. It was this story, whether historical fact or later embellishment, that became associated with the figure reported inside the home. The apparition became known as the Black Monk of Pontefract. No surviving records conclusively confirm the identity of such a monk, nor do they definitively place his execution at the exact location of the home. What remains are the repeated descriptions given by witnesses. A tall, robed figure, always silent and always watchful, and the violent nature of the haunting itself. For the Pritchard family, the truth of the legend mattered less than what they were experiencing, and the haunting was no longer unseen. By the time the figure had begun to appear, the atmosphere inside the house had changed completely. What had once been unexplained disturbances now felt intentional. The family no longer spoke about whether something was happening, only about how long they could endure it. Then, one evening, everything stopped. Without warning, the lights inside the house went out. The sudden darkness followed almost immediately by Diane's scream. Joe and Philip grabbed torches and ran toward the sound. As they reached the staircase, what they saw left no doubt that the situation had escalated beyond anything that they had experienced before. Diane was being dragged up the stairs by an unseen force. Her body was pulled violently upward, her hair and clothing yanked as though something had a hold of her. As she struggled, her screams turned into choking, gurgling sounds, as if pressure was being applied to her throat. Joe and Philip rushed forward and grabbed her, pulling her back with all their strength. They later described it as a struggle, a physical tug of war with something they could not see. For several moments, Diane's body was held suspended between them and whatever had seized her. Then, without explanation, the force released her. Diane collapsed, gasping for air. Around her neck were bright red marks, which witnesses later said darkened into deep bruises. The markings appeared consistent with fingers, positioned in a way that suggested she had been gripped by the throat. The family revived her with some brandy, and this was the moment that they accepted they could no longer remain in that house. Shortly afterward, they left to stay with relatives, and in the days that followed, Diane did not return. As her absence continued, the disturbances gradually subsided, the noises faded, the movement stopped, and the violence ceased. The haunting, which had lasted for many months, appeared to lose its strength once Diane was gone. Eventually, the family returned to the house and attempted to resume their lives. The rooms were cleaned, the dust settled, and the house fell silent. But for those who had been there, and for the many witnesses who had seen the events unfold, what happened inside that house was not easily forgotten. The final incident had made one thing clear. Whatever had been inside the house had been willing to harm a child, consistent with the records found about the Black Monk. And that was something the family could not stay and face.